The title of my talk is Probing the Costly Dynamics of Cognitive Effort. And over the next few moments, I'll try to unpack what I mean by each of those terms. So first, I wanted to focus on cognitive effort, as it might be something that you have an intuition for, but that you don't necessarily you may not be aware of some of the research behind this phrase. So the way that I'll be using the phrase cognitive effort is I'll be meaning the engaged proportion of limited capacity central processing. Central processing as in of the brain. Now, in previous work, it's been shown that cognitive effort tracks with several variables, including task difficulty. So the more difficult the task, the more cognitive effort you need to expend in order to perform the task. Cognitive effort is also correlated with task novelty. So when tasks are very novel, they're very new, you haven't performed them before, you will need to exert more cognitive effort than if you are performing a task that is not novel, that is familiar to you, that you have done before. And in addition to task difficulty and task novelty, cognitive effort is also associated with several individual factors, including age, neurodiversity, and other biophysical characteristics. Importantly, evidence also suggests that cognitive effort, while it is correlated with these variables, is not identical to any of them. So cognitive effort is not the same as the difficulty of the task. It's not perfectly correlated with motivation or attention or cognitive control. So it's important to study cognitive effort on its own. So for us, we're going to be asking the question of how can we study cognitive effort in a way that's quantitative and measurable. And before I tell you how I'm really interested in quantifying cognitive effort, I want to tell you a little bit about how previous work has measured it. So a few of the common measurements include first self-report. So you can simply ask a participant, how effortful did that feel? And next time you perform a really difficult or novel task, you can ask yourself, how effortful did that feel for me? The second kind of measurement is one of the autonomic response. So these are measures of physiological markers of autonomic arousal. They would include pupil dilation. So how dilated are your pupils? Skin conductance response, peripheral vasoconstriction, decreased heart rate variability, and increased systolic blood pressure. So these are physical measurements of the body that can be an indicator of the cognitive effort that's involved. But I think there's a very good reason to turn to the brain for a quantitative measurement of cognitive effort. And there are several reasons why we should do that. But one I think is very well illustrated by this study from Yigi and colleagues that was published in 2017. So what the investigators did is that they noted that something that many of us have seen before in prior studies, which is that some individuals can attain the very same level of performance as someone else, but require vastly different levels of neural activation. So maybe there are two individuals in the study and they both achieve the same performance, but one of them has to activate much more of the cortex and subcortex than another person. So here's a picture of this particular study showing that effect. On the top row, you see the supposedly more efficient individual. This is somebody who activates less of their cortex. The activation is indicated by these red and yellow blobs here. Then the person in the lower row, which, as you can see, activates much more of the cortex in order to perform the particular task. So what has been argued in the literature is that this less efficient individual on the lower row is expending more cognitive effort than the more efficient individual. Now, it is, while the activation level is something that can be an important indicator of cognitive effort, there is also work suggesting that the complexity of the activation time series is an important marker of effort as well. So it's not just what is the average amount of activation that is needed to perform a task. It's also a question of the dynamical complexity of that activation time series. And so this is work that was done by Mark Churchill and colleagues and published in Scientific Reports in 2016. And what the investigators did is that they showed that the Hurst exponent, which is a measure of the dynamical complexity of the time series, was correlated with the cognitive effort exerted on the task. So these are two different ways of thinking about how the brain might be an indicator of, or might harbor an indicator of, the cognitive effort that is expended by the participant. But what I would like to draw your attention to is the fact that neither of these brain measurements addresses what I will call the cost of orchestration. And that is all of that activation that we've just seen and the complexity of the activation time series has to be organized on top of this very complex structural network. So this is a picture constructed from diffusion-weighted imaging data in a healthy human adult. And what you can see is the white matter connections between different pieces of the brain. Here is the front of the brain and the back of the brain, the top and the bottom. And what you can see here is that there's a really non-random, but also not perfectly ordered pattern of connectivity between brain regions that may have a non-trivial effect on how activation is distributed throughout the cortex during the performance of a task. So what I would like to do is to ask, how might we measure the cognitive effort that is expended by taking into account that underlying structural network? So I'll divide my comments into three sections. In the first section, I'd like to discuss the cost of orchestrating activation on a network, and we'll talk particularly about characteristics of the neural system that allow us to talk about that cost in a more quantitative fashion. In the second section of the talk, I'd like to discuss the relationship between the orchestration of activation on the network and cognitive effort itself. So we'll start with sort of more like theory and the big idea in the first section, and then we'll move into connecting that to cognitive effort in the second section. And then in the third section, we will talk about some of the functional manifestations of that cost. So let's get into it. So first, I want to ask the question, what is activation? That is a word that I've been using for the last few slides, but I want to give you a picture of what I mean by that word. So activation states are patterns of activity across neurons or neural units. So I'll show you three activation states here, state 1, state 2, and state 3. The color here indicates the level of activity, and the units of this vector are either neurons or neuronal ensembles. And so what you can see is that these activation states differ from one another, and they often differ in an important way in relation to the function that they're performing. So those different activation states can represent very different objects in our environment, or different events, or different experiences, or even different concepts. Now, cognitive effort is required for a state to change. So for us to move from state 1 to state 2, or from state 2 to state 3. And in turn, that state change provides us as humans with the flexible and actuatable function that we enjoy. So the key challenge then is to understand how state changes happen. How does one state transition into another state? And we can make that question a little bit more concrete by asking what features of neural systems constrain which transitions can happen and which transitions can't happen, or which transitions are easy versus which transitions are difficult. To quantify the ease or difficulty of state transitions, I want to talk not just about the state here, but also the network underneath. So here we have a state where the first 3 units are active, the next 3 units are not particularly active, and then the next 4 units are very active. And that's sitting on top of this network where the first 3 units are connected in a triangle, the next 3 units are connected in a line, and the last 4 units are connected in a square. Now, we know from the way that neural systems work that active neurons can spread activity to other neurons around them, particularly if those neurons are connected with one another. So electrical signals can be passed from one neuron to another if they are connected. So what that means is that the organization of connectivity between neurons determines how easy it is for activation to spread and to exist in certain states. To see how this works, I wanted to bring up a few intuitive examples, and then I'll tell you how we quantified this intuition. So first, here's an intuitive example of a state that is easy to attain for this particular neural network. So here's a network where we have two modules. There's dense interconnectivity inside of the module, and then there's only one link between the two modules. Now, it's relatively easy for this network to hold the activation state of the first 5 units being active and the next 5 units being not particularly active. And why do I say that that's easy? Well, because as soon as one of these units is active inside of the first module, it can spread that activity to other neurons around it or other neural units around it. And if I want to keep that activation from moving into the second module, I only need one inhibitory signal to be gating that single connection. So this is relatively easy. Let's contrast that with some more difficult state network pairs. So here on the bottom left, for example, you see a network where there are the same two modules, but now they're densely interconnected with one another. If we wanted to hold this state of activation of the first 5 and deactivation of the second 5 on top of this heavily connected network, we would need to inject a lot of control signals to cordon off the activity to stay in the left module and not move into the right module, despite the fact that there are so many connections. So that requires a lot of control, which by extension, we are thinking of in terms of cognitive effort. And the last example I want to show you for a state network pair that is difficult is this one, where you have two modules with one connection between them, and the state that we would like to attain and maintain has activation of the first unit, deactivation of the second, activation of the third, deactivation of the fourth, etc. So it's this binary on-off state, but holding that on top of this modular network is difficult because as soon as one unit in the module is activated, it can spread that activity to other units around it. And if you want to keep several of these off, you need to have inhibitory signals being injected consistently. Now, the same intuition of what makes a state network pair easy versus difficult, we can also extend to understanding state transitions. So at the top here, I'm showing you an easy state transition, and in the bottom, I'm showing you a difficult state transition. So in the top, we're going to move from activation of the first 5 units and deactivation of the second to the opposite. So we want to deactivate the first 5 and activate the second 5. How would we do this? Well, one way that we could do this is to have a generic inhibitory signal sent into the first module and a generic excitatory signal sent into the second module, and that would allow us to flip this state. So I'm going to say that that's relatively easy because it only requires 2 control signals. In contrast, here's a difficult state transition where you have that same modular network underneath, but now you have this binary on-off state. And what you want to do is to move anything that was off initially to on, and anything that was on initially to off. That enacting that state transition is going to require an inhibitory or excitatory control signal on every single unit inside this network. You can't take advantage of the network to allow the activity to flow the way you want it to. You actually kind of need to fight against the structure of the network to enforce the state that you wish. So this transition requires a more extensive set of control signals. Okay, so let's formalize that intuition. Over the last couple of years, we've been working with Fabio Pasqualetti to formalize that intuition in the context of network control theory. And network control theory is an approach that allows us to think about how we would move activation states on a network from one state to another. It requires us to think not just about the structure of the network or its topology, but also about the dynamics that the system has and the way in which activation states can change. So a very simple way of writing down, a very simple way of implementing network control theory is to think of a relatively simplistic model of dynamics. a very, very simple one here is a linear discrete time and time invariant network model, where we would have the state of the brain at time t+1 being equal to the weighted adjacency matrix, which we typically would derive from the diffusion imaging data in healthy humans, times the state of the brain at time t, and then plus the control. So B sub kappa is a matrix typically with ones along the diagonal that indicate which regions the control input is being injected into, and then U sub kappa of t is the control input that is injected into kappa regions at time t. With that approach, we can then think through how much control input is required to push the state of the brain from any particular initial state, that's called x naught, to a preferred final state, xt. Here I'm showing you this pictorially, where the first state, the initial state, is activation of motor cortex in blue, and the final state is activation of visual cortex in this royal purple. In order to simulate that trajectory and understand how much energy is required for the trajectory to occur, where we should be injecting control input and at what times, we will minimize this cost function that has two factors. The first one is related to the distance of the current state x from the target state, x sub t. And then the second piece here is the energy that is needed. And we minimize the distance and the energy needed both for biological reasons. So we minimize the energy that's needed for the controlled trajectory because biological systems, including the brain, are typically under large metabolic constraints that will tend to cool the energy down as much as possible while still attaining a particular level of performance. And secondly, we minimize this distance parameter here because we want to enact a trajectory that's relatively straight through the state space rather than meandering into parts of the state space that may be irrelevant to the task or actually irrelevant or not beneficial to the task. Okay, in addition to determining the amount of energy that is required for that particular trajectory from one state to another, we can also ask how much energy is required to maintain a brain state. So how do I hold the state from x naught to xt and have them be the same? The reason that this is important is that the ability to persist in a particular state is something that's cognitively needed. We need to devote our attention to particular states for a long period of time in order to enact a particular performance. And that persistence will require energy as long as the state that we are holding is not a minimum on the available energy landscape. So the summary of this intuition and approach is that each state change has an associated energy cost, and the network architecture of neural systems constrains which transitions are easy, requiring a small change in energy, versus which transitions are hard, requiring a large change in energy. So that brings me to the second part of the talk, where I'd like to discuss the relationship between this notion of orchestration on the network and cognitive effort. And I'll mostly be talking about work from Urs Braun that was published in Nature Communications, and I'll mention a piece that's currently in revision by Xiaosong He, but the preprint is available. So here we want to ask what sorts of transitions are important for the brain, and we'll talk both about transitioning between very different states and also maintaining a state for a long period of time. And we'll be able to focus on both of those by choosing a task that requires both state change and state maintenance. So the task that Urs Braun decided to focus on is a working memory task. And what this task does is that it shows participants a sequence of stimuli and asks those participants to perform one of two tasks. The easier version of the task, the one that requires less cognitive effort, is just to respond to whatever the stimulus is in front of you. So if the stimulus is A, you'll press a button to indicate that you see stimulus A. If it's stimulus B, you'll press a button to say that you see stimulus B. In contrast, the more demanding part of the task is to remember what stimulus occurred 2 stimuli ago or 2 moments ago. And so if you saw A 2 moments ago, you'll respond A. So you need to notice what's in front of you, but recall what happened 2 stimuli ago. So that's why it's called a working memory task, because it requires working memory. What Urs wanted to do was to ask how much control energy is required to transition from this simply attention demanding state, so just pay attention to what's in front of you, to the working memory state. So remember what happened 2 stimuli ago. And then how much energy is required to persistently hold either of those states. The states were defined by taking images of the brain using functional magnetic resonance imaging as people are performing the task. So by taking those images, we can construct the state, the pattern of activation that's characteristic of participants performing the 0-back task or the attention demanding task, versus the pattern of activation that's required, that is displayed when people are performing the 2-back task. So here is the first piece of data where along the y-axis is the control energy that was needed to make the transition from the 0-back activation state to the 2-back activation state. You can see that control energy, and then in contrast, you can see how much control energy is required to move from the 2-back condition down to the 0-back condition. What you can see is that there's a significant difference between these two. Every data point is a participant in the study. And what we observe is that it requires more control energy to move into the more cognitively demanding task than to come out of the cognitively demanding task to the less demanding task. So what we conclude here is that transitioning into a cognitively more demanding state required more control energy than the opposite transition, suggesting that the control energy is an intuitive marker of cognitive effort. Now we can ask the question of how much control energy is required for participants to hold either of these states. So to either hold the 0-back activation state or to hold the 2-back working memory state. And what you can see is along the y-axis is the stability of the state. That is simply the inverse of the control energy required to persist in that state. So the 0-back condition has greater stability than the 2-back condition. What that means is that the 0-back state requires less control energy to hold than the 2-back state does. Interestingly, I did want to note that there's significant individual variability here. Again, the data points are individual people in the experiment. And we wanted to understand that individual variability more. So we examined its relationship to the behavior of the participant. And what we found is that participants who had greater stability in their 2-back state also tended to show higher task accuracy. So in other words, people who required less control energy to hold that state were also those individuals who performed better. So these two pieces of information suggest a nice relationship between control energy from this model and the cognitive effort involved in the task. So as a sort of brief interim summary of this second part, tasks that demand greater cognitive effort also require greater control energy to reach and to maintain. But an open question to us in the field is that control energy underpinned by metabolic expenditure? So in other words, what is I've been using the phrase control energy, but is it a metabolic energy that we're talking about? Or is it simply this theoretical notion from the model? And I think that's a really important question because the control energy that we have estimated is a computational measurement, but there hasn't yet been a direct study of how that computational measurement might relate to the biological process of expending metabolic energy. So ideally, what we would like to do is to understand the relationship between cognitive effort, control energy, and glucose metabolism, which is a marker of energy usage in the brain. So I'm not going to go into the details of this paper because I think it's outside the scope of this particular talk, but I did want to raise it in case you're curious. So Xiaosong He was a postdoc in the lab before he moved to start his own lab just last year. And he has a paper that you can find the preprint on bioRxiv, where he examined the relationship between control energy and glucose metabolism to ask the question of whether the control energy measures that we are estimating are related to metabolic energy. So is there a relationship between basically the theory and the biology? To address that question, he used FDG PET imaging, which allows us to estimate the amount of glucose metabolism in each region of the brain in any given participant. And then he also used the diffusion imaging data from humans to construct these connectome maps and estimate the control energy that's needed for particular state transitions. The highlight, and you'll have to dig into the paper if you want the details, is that control energy is strongly correlated with glucose metabolism. So that's a really nice piece of evidence to suggest that this measurement that we have that's theoretically motivated and computationally attained is correlated with a biophysical estimate of energy. Okay, so that brings me to the third and final section of my remarks that I wanted to go over today. And that is on the topic of the functional manifestations of this orchestration. So all of these energetic demands that I've been discussing related to cognitive effort are likely to impact the observed dynamics of the brain. And what we would like to do is to understand that impact a little bit better. So far, I've been talking about single activation states and a trajectory between different activation states, but I haven't told you a lot about the continuous dynamics that are involved. So that's what I'd like to do now. And this is work that was led by Chris Lin. At the time, he was a graduate student in physics in the lab. He's now a James S. McDonald Foundation postdoctoral fellow. And he's between Princeton University and CUNY. So what Chris did is that he wanted to understand whether cognitive effort pushed the brain away from equilibrium. So he was motivated by studies of other biological systems, where it's been shown that to perform several different biological functions, systems tend to diverge from equilibrium. And they do that by burning energy, as we've just been discussing, but also by breaking what's called detailed balance, which I'll define in a second, and establishing an arrow of time. And along the way, as they're doing this, they produce entropy in the environment, which is then a key feature of non-equilibrium dynamics. So I want to focus in on this second marker of non-equilibrium dynamics, and that is broken detailed balance. Well, in order to tell you what broken detailed balance is, I first want to tell you what detailed balance is. So detailed balance is where you have states of the system. So here is a system that has 4 states: state 1, state 2, state 3, and state 4. And these arrows indicate the fluxes between states. And what you can see in detailed balance is that the flux from state 4 to state 1 is the same as from 1 to 4. And that's true for all of these state transitions. And so the entropy production is 0. In contrast, when detailed balance is broken, the net fluxes from one state to another are not the same as from this state back again. And I'm showing you that just by the difference in the size and saturation of these arrows. So that broken detailed balance is this marker of non-equilibrium dynamics. And when that happens, there is a production of entropy in the environment. So delta S will be greater than 0. So how would we study something like this in the brain and assess to what degree it's related to cognitive effort? Well, the first thing that we can do is to assess this broken detail balance by extracting brain states and then estimating the fluxes between them. we can define brain states by, for example, the first two principal components of a neuroimaging time series of regional activity. And we can do that after computing across time points and across subjects. So this image here, for example, the colors indicate the z-scored activation. So green means more activated, orange means less activated. These arrows represent hypothetical fluxes between states. And I'll note that this projection into this two-dimensional space captures more than 30% of the variance in activity, so just with two states. But you can extrapolate to more states to capture more and more of the variance. But with any of these projections of the dynamics into a state space, you can probe for broken detail balance by calculating the net fluxes of transitions between different regions of a state space. So here are some data to show that effect and also to demonstrate that the brain breaks detail balance differently depending on what it's doing. So on the left-hand side here, you see what happens when the brain is at rest. And then on the right-hand side, you see what happens when the brain is performing a gambling task. What we observe in both cases, but particularly in the task case, is that the fluxes between neural states combine with one another to form distinct loops in that whole state space. And that loop is a characteristic feature of the broken detail balance in steady state systems. So you can see that loop really strongly here and less strongly, but still to some degree in the resting state. Now, to help you understand and unpack what this figure means, the probability distribution is given by the color. The net fluxes between states are given by these arrows. The flux scale is over here on the top right. And then these gray discs are the two standard deviation confidence intervals. The two axes are principal component 1 and principal component 2. So what we can see just from this little bit of data is that the brain fundamentally breaks detailed balance at these very large scales, macroscopic scales. And the strength of broken detail balance depends critically on the cognitive function that's being performed. So whether the brain is at rest or involved in a gambling task. But we can push that further. I just showed you two states of the brain, but we can actually look at 8 different states of the brain, and we can quantify the degree of broken detail balance and summarize that in the entropy production. So that's what I'm showing you here. Along the y-axis is the entropy production, and then along the x-axis are listed the different states, the resting state being the one over here on the left, and then here's the gambling one that we just saw, and then there are others as well. What we observe across these different states is that the resting state produces the least entropy, so is closest to equilibrium. And all the other tasks produce more entropy, so are farther away from equilibrium, with a motor task being the farthest. So now the last question that we have from this approach is, can we relate this broken detail balance and entropy production to the cognitive effort that's involved in the task? And I'm actually going to break that question down into 2 sub-questions. First, I want to ask, is entropy production related to the physical effort that somebody is exerting? And then I'm going to ask if the entropy production is related to the cognitive effort that people are exerting. So on the left, we'll see the physical effort. On the right, we'll see the cognitive effort. So the answer is yes, entropy production tracks physical effort in the form of response rates. Here along the y-axis, you see the entropy production, and along the x-axis is the response rate of the participant. So that's how many responses were required by the task. What you can see is a strong positive correlation, such that tasks that require a high response rate also tend to produce greater entropy, and tasks that require a lower response rate produce less entropy. So this indicates that entropy production tracks with physical effort in the form of response rates. Now, what about cognitive effort? Well, what we did to assess cognitive effort is to focus on one particular task that has the same response rate in 2 different components of the task, but very different cognitive effort. So we wanted to hold the response rate constant to evaluate the relationship to cognitive effort. So the one task that had 2 different parts with differing amounts of cognitive effort, but the same response rate, was the working memory task. And you're now familiar with that one from the second part of my talk. So along the y-axis here, you see the entropy production, and then along the x-axis, you see either the low cognitive effort part, that's the 0 back task, or the high cognitive effort part, that's the 2 back working memory task. And what you can see is that entropy production is higher in the task that requires more cognitive effort and lower in the task that requires less cognitive effort. So what this suggests is that entropy production and the breaking of detailed balance is explained both by physical effort and by cognitive effort. So to broaden back out and then leave time for questions, what we've done over the last few minutes is to first discuss the cost of orchestrating activation on a network. And what we were particularly interested in is how the structure of the white matter network in the human brain determines to some degree the energy that is required to change activation states. And then we used that idea in the second part of the talk to evaluate a task that requires more versus less cognitive effort. And we showed that the task that requires more cognitive effort also required greater control energy, or this energy of orchestration. In the last section, we focused on the functional manifestations in the form of non-equilibrium dynamics. So when I titled this talk, Probing the Costly Dynamics of Cognitive Effort, I wanted to underscore the fact that understanding cognitive effort, I mean, yes, we can use self-report, as I mentioned. Yes, we can use autonomic responses, but there's a real reason to move to the brain as a objective marker of cognitive effort. But when we do that, I think it's important to take into account the fact that activation itself and even the complexity of the dynamics of activation depend on the white matter structure underneath, which allows for signals to be transferred between different areas and therefore drive changes in activation states. Then after discussing that point, we moved into discussing network control theory and how it can be employed to define and investigate that orchestration. It provides this notion of control energy, or the energy to enact brain state transitions. And notably, we observed that control energy tracks with cognitive effort on a very common task that assesses executive function. I also mentioned that control energy tracks with glucose metabolism, although I didn't get into the details of that study. That's the one that was led by Xiaosong He in the lab. At the same time, that cognitive effort is associated with broken detailed balance at the large scale, as well as entropy production. And that indicates that the brain is moving further from equilibrium when it is engaging in a cognitively effortful task. So with that, I'd like to just acknowledge the people who were important in this work and the funding that has supported it. Thank you so much for listening, and I would really love to hear any questions that you have before we move to the break.